Hello and welcome to Talking to Thinkers. In this episode, I shall be talking to the philosopher Simon Blackburn. Professor Blackburn has enjoyed a notable reputation in the academic world over the last 50 years, which culminated in his appointment as the Bertrand Russell Professor of Philosophy at the University of Cambridge. But he's also enjoyed an enviable reputation as a thinker who can make philosophy both accessible and engaging to the public. It is therefore a real pleasure to be talking to Professor Blackburn today, and I hope you enjoy our conversation. Thank you. Hello, Simon, and welcome to Talking to Thinkers.
Well, thank you for having me.
Great. Well, maybe if we start with where you grew up and what your parents were like.
Yes, it's rather difficult to remember some of the things in my childhood. I grew up in a village called East Harrington, which is just outside Sunderland in County Durham. My father was an executive with the Sunderland and South Shields Water Company, as it was then called. That was before it all got taken over by the French. The house I grew up in was it wasn't by no means wealthy. We were comfortably off, I'd say. At any rate, it was education was a big priority for both my parents. So they took pains to get me through a prep school, that's private, of course, and then to a public school, which, with the English genius for language, meant a private school. That was my education. My childhood was, I think, not at all abnormal. I got a sister and an elder sister and a younger brother. I suppose I can say I did well at school. I got a scholarship to Clifton, which was my public school. And I always found schoolwork relatively easy. I don't think I was particularly diligent, but and I certainly wasn't diligent at things which failed to excite my interest. The big failures were our language, I think. I loathe Latin, I think quite rightly, and I didn't excel at French. I think I got sort of tourist French, but not much more. On the other hand, I very much like mathematics. It was partly the rather charismatic teacher, partly my father was, as an engineer, he was interested in mathematics. And that's kind of worked for me. And I think that was the reason why I got a scholarship to Clifton. And indeed, at school, that was a boarding school, I specialized in maths, physics, and chemistry. And that's what I took my A-levels in. Apart from work, I think as I say, I don't think my childhood was in any way exceptional. My closest friend was the son of a farmer, and I have happy memories of riding around on tractors and so forth, and herding cows. My family wasn't well enough off to take extensive holidays, let alone foreign holidays. And so the first time I went abroad in my life was when I was in my 20s, which is pretty unusual by today's standards. So that's about it. I was, as I remember, fairly happy at school. There were none of the horrors of boarding school life, which you sometimes read about. The house I was in at Clifton was run by a very civilized man, and he introduced me really to fine arts. So an interest in painting and art has always been with me throughout my adult life. And I had a happy time. I seem to have a sort of knack for making and keeping friends, which is very nice and has been a great part of my life. Um, I think that's about all I can think of saying about myself, actually, about my youth. Um,
And you said you went to Clifton,
mm,
and that was a public school, which basically means it's a private school.
yes.
Did you find that you were meeting boys there from a higher echelon socially, or did you find that easy? Because you said you came from a
Mm,
comfortable but not a well-off family.
no. Um, I think I found it fairly easy on the whole. I wasn't very conscious of class distinctions. One of the good things about a school uniform is it smooths out any disparities in wealth, so that didn't bother me at all. Um, I think the ethos of the school was certainly hostile to displays of that kind. We were a fairly egalitarian bunch, I think. Um, the only sort of thing I remember about being peculiar was I had quite a strong Sunderland accent, and Clifton is in Bristol, so I stood out because of my strong northern accent. And I remember being teased in a scripture lesson. I think the master had made some comment about the fall, the Garden of Eden, and the myth of the fall. And I was supposed to have said, but surely Sir Adam was a bad man. and this, um, this, I was teased about that for some time. I remember that. But alas, I fairly quickly lost my northern accent. It's very difficult to hear one now. Although people who are skilled at language sometimes say they can still hear a bit. My A's are a little bit flatter than those of Boris Johnson and people like that.
Yes. So, I mean, from your description of your kind of academic interests, it looked like you would have probably done, something like medicine or science or even mathematics at
Yes.
university,
Mm-hmm.
but you end up doing philosophy.
Yes,
So,
that's
can
right.
you explain how that happened?
Well, the beginning was a master at Clifton who thought that I was on track to go and read natural sciences at Cambridge, and he thought that it was important to have a sort of what I think of as a thin veneer of culture to deceive Cambridge's interviewers. So he gave me and a small group of people who were going up to Cambridge for entrance. He gave us the book G.E. Moore's Principia Ethica. That was written in 1903 and was a sort of Bible for a generation of Bloomsbury, people like Keynes, Virginia Woolf, and so on. I read this with some dismay, actually. I didn't accept a great deal of it. And I remember in particular, one of Moore's arguments is directed against the view that beauty lies in the eye of the beholder, or that in general that values are subjective, they lie only within the minds of people who make value judgments. And Moore's argument against this is sometimes known as the isolation argument. So he asks you to imagine a landscape, and you can imagine a really ugly landscape, if you like. So you imagine a landscape which is, derelict wasteland, heaps of slag, a fair amount of rubbish and disorder about it. That's absolutely horrible. And now he says, well, imagine that landscape, but nobody's looking at it. There's no witness of this landscape. There's nobody there. And now what do you think of it? And of course you say, well, it's still ugly and horrible. That doesn't change. But Moore took that to show that the fact of it being ugly or horrible was not dependent on anybody's cognition of it. And I thought that was a thoroughly rotten argument because, as it were, the person he's addressing, the reader, in this case myself, is exercising their own imagination and their own sensibility. And that doesn't go away, even if you make a conscious effort to imagine that there's nobody witnessing this slag heap. It's still a slag heap, and you're thinking about it, and you're thinking of it as ugly. But the same goes then for beautiful, or I think the reverse, a lovely landscape with streams and bees and butterflies and so on. You can get the same result. You'll go on thinking that it's beautiful, even if in your imagination there's nobody looking at it. So I found myself intrigued by this. I was intrigued that what I thought of was a thoroughly rotten argument had got into print and was so influential on people. And I said as much to the class, and generally speaking, I think carried most people with me. And this gave me a sort of confidence to look into philosophy to see what was going on. And so by the time I got to the Cambridge interview, I'd not only read more, but I think I'd started at least Bertrand Russell's History of Western Philosophy. Certainly I read that in my teens at about that time. And I thought this was absolutely fascinating. And I'd sort of fallen out of love with natural sciences, I think independently of this. I felt I was quite good at them, but I wasn't in the top rank. There were kids who were better at mathematics than I was. There were kids who were better at physics than I was. I did have a very good memory, and I could remember chemistry as well as anyone. And chemistry, A and S level in those days, was largely a matter of memorizing, facts about sodium chloride and barium sulfate and things. So I could do that without much difficulty. But I felt I was not really cut out to be a top flight research scientist. And I wasn't really content to settle for second best. So I decided to switch to philosophy. Well, in fact, I didn't decide to switch to philosophy. I decided to switch to English literature. But the interviewer who was talking to me prior to Cambridge entrance, just said very sharply, he was a historian, it turns out, I didn't know this, but he just said very sharply, no, you can't read English literature, sloppy subject, you won't like it. Moral sciences is the thing for you. And I said, what's that? He said, it's what we call philosophy. And I said, oh yes, I'm interested in that. And I got a place and started on the philosophy course, on the moral sciences course. And I did love it. It was absolutely fitted me like a glove and has done ever since.
Well, that's interesting. And just before we talk about some of the maybe teachers and influences you had during your undergraduate years,
yeah.
What's remarkable, though, about that story you just talked about, the Principia Ethica by Moore, is that, most of us, when we'd read a book like that, would feel if we disagreed with it, we must be wrong. Moore must be right, I must be wrong. And yet,
yes, I know.
Where did that come from?
I'm slightly ashamed. I must have been a cocky youth, I suppose. I suppose, I'd never been a debater or anything like that. There were debating societies. But of course, with my friends, we talked endlessly about things. And I suppose that gives you practice and confidence. I was never sporty, for example, so I didn't spend my afternoons playing more rugby or cricket than I could get away with. And I think, with the group of friends, we had intellectual interests, and in a very adolescent way, sort of talked about the philosophy of religion and things. So it wasn't completely out of the blue, let's say that, but it was it was a change of direction. I mentioned that my housemaster was a very civilized man. As well as fine arts, he made sure to take us to the theatre as often as possible. And Bristol, of course, had the Bristol Old Vic, which is a very distinguished and, in those days, was a rather wonderful company. Had people like Leonard Rossiter in its cast, and it used to put on very good plays. And I remember going to quite a lot of those. See Mother Courage, Brecht, Ionesco, and so on. So I had a sort of veneer of culture, and that, of course, is also a veneer about an acquaintance with ideas. And I think that the school encouraged that, and I'm eternally grateful. I'm even more grateful to the chap who interviewed me, a man called Vivian, who was a historian. Because if I'd gone to the interviewer next door, and as far as I know, we'd just chosen at random, he might have said, right, go and read English literature then. Or might have said, no, you can't change. We'll give you a place for natural sciences, but not for a humanities course. So my entire life would have been utterly different.
Mm. I know the capriciousness of life is quite remarkable, isn't it?
It's remarkable, yes. It's
many things pivot or something like that, yes.
Frightening to think about.
And the other thing that's kind of comes out of that, what you say there, is even though you specialized in the, for A levels or whatever it was called back then in the sciences, you still had this kind of broader range education.
Yes.
Which is, for people outside of England, we probably think, well, you specialize quite early. Whereas, for example, in Ireland, we don't. We're not allowed. We have to do 6 or 7 subjects.
Yes. I think it's a great mistake. I mean, as I mentioned, my father was an engineer, and my parents had set their hearts on me doing some sort of natural science or medicine, as you mentioned. So, in fact, it was quite a battle when I announced that I was going to read philosophy. I don't think my father was ever really reconciled to it. Although a story from one of his friends was that he'd been talking about my career a bit later after I graduated, and indeed had gone to teach in Oxford. And my father's supposed to have said, well, Simon's very clever. He's so clever, he's got the world to pay him for doing nothing.
That's what you call a backhanded compliment.
It's a very backhanded compliment.
Well, he probably was proud of you. He just was one of those parents who didn't like shouting about it.
I think that may be true, yeah.
That was kind of that generation. But but if we kind of go back into, you're now an undergraduate doing what they call the moral sciences,
yes,
Cambridge, which basically means you're doing philosophy.
Sure.
Can you maybe give us an insight about who your teachers were and who had a big influence on you and why?
Yes, sure. My direct teacher, my supervisor in Trinity College, this was the college I was at, was a man called Casimir Louis, very charismatic, wonderful teacher. He was a Polish refugee just before the onset of the Second World War. He'd been brought up in Warsaw and come to Cambridge. He specialized in logic, and Poland had a very, very powerful logic tradition. You've probably heard that Polish cryptographers were in the forefront of breaking the Enigma code and so forth in the Second World War. So So Casimir had that background, and he gave us a very solid grounding in formal logic, which again I found very congenial. I enjoyed it, and I was interested enough in it to actually take the specialist logic and mathematics part 2, as they call it, which was the third year of the 3 undergraduate years. I specialized in logic for that. Other people went into the history of philosophy or whatever it might be, classical philosophy. But logic had captured my interest. And along with logic, perhaps even more so, I was interested in the philosophy of science. There were 2 influences there. One was a man called Ian Hacking, who is still with us. Casimir died 25 years ago, but Ian Hacking is still alive and lives in Canada. He was Canadian, but he'd come to Cambridge, and he and Richard Braithwaite, who was much older. Braithwaite was one of the 2 professors. The other one was a man called John Wisdom. But Braithwaite and Hacking were both philosophers of science. They both wrote about probability, and I got very interested in that, and indeed started my PhD on that. So that was the direction my interest took. But the Cambridge course, of course, required much more. It required epistemology and metaphysics, a paper in ethics. What else? An essay paper. I can't remember what my essays were about. Philosophy of mind. So there was quite a coverage of the philosophy syllabus. I think its weakness was that there was very little history in it. In fact, I used to say, and I think this is absolutely true, that I graduated from Cambridge without ever having read a philosophy book written before 1879, when Frege wrote the Grundlag and the Foundations of Arithmetic. That was the oldest philosophy book I'd ever read. So I hadn't read any Kant, I hadn't read any Hume, I hadn't read any Hobbes, and so on. And this, I think, was a little bit shocking. I think the course could have insisted on at least an acquaintance with 1 or 2 of the classics. Well, I rectified that for myself as my career went on. But I mean, the first historical philosopher I think I read and fell in love with was David Hume, whom we can probably go on to talk about later. But as far as my education went, Cambridge was very unhistorical. I think there was a general belief that philosophy had, as it were, started with Russell and More and was dominated by Wittgenstein. So his ghost was still very present in Cambridge. This was in the 1960s. Wittgenstein had died in 1951, but his spirit still walked, as it were. And John Wisdom carried on a sort of Wittgensteinian flame in Trinity College, but he didn't ever teach me directly. I had conversations directly with both Hacking and Richard Braithwaite, but not with John Wisdom. Other people did. He was very accessible. It's just I wasn't particularly interested in the sort of Wittgensteinian slant. And Wittgenstein was largely influential in the philosophy of mind in those days. And that wasn't my special interest. So I didn't have much to do with Wisdom. He was, in some respects, a figure of fun, actually. He was very eccentric. And he was a particular target of Casimir Louis. And Louis, in his lectures, would I mentioned that he was charismatic and he was very dramatic. He had a Polish kind of flair about him. And Louis would start one course quite famously saying, professional wisdom used to think, and then stop. And, we used to think, and then and that P at something or other. The pause after used to think was very noticeable.
And very deliberate as well.
Very deliberate. Oh yes, yes.
It's interesting you mentioned that though about the ahistorical or ahistorical, feature of analytic philosophy, and that's changed a lot, in the last 30 or 40 years, and we could talk about that probably later.
Sure.
Because there was even philosophers back in the 50s. I'm thinking like Bernard Williams, who back in his early part of his career was quite ahistorical. And then became not only historical, but felt that history was indispensable to philosophy and not just nice window dressing.
Indeed, yes. So, and Bernard, later on in my career, Bernard was an influence on me and on many other people in Cambridge. He arrived in Cambridge only a couple of years before I left to go to Oxford. So we sort of crossed paths rather, but in that couple of years, I got to know him and admire him, as everybody did. He was a very remarkable man.
Well, yes. Maybe we actually talk a little bit about Bernard then, because
sure.
What was it about Bernard? This was probably in the late 60s. He arrived in Cambridge. His star was probably shining already.
Yes, it was.
As a formidable intelligence.
Yes.
So how did you get to know him, and what impressed you about him?
I got to know him through a graduate seminar. There was a weekly, I was by then a graduate student, and there was a weekly graduate seminar, and Bernard came along, and I think he was appointed perhaps in 67, or maybe 68, I'm not quite sure now. But at any rate, as soon as he came along, he started shooting off fireworks. And I think he was a little surprised at the levels of rigor and precision that had been instilled in us in the Cambridge training we'd had in Cambridge education. People were very, in a sense, if you think of the writings of G. Moore, they're almost painfully slow and painfully exact. We've got this very strong sense that Moore's trying to find exactly the right words for exactly whatever phenomenon he's talking about. And I think Bernard was a little bit more flamboyant and to our ears, a little bit hit and miss. So I think he met a more critical reception in Cambridge than he was used to. But he rose to the challenge quite remarkably, and I think he was very successful there, and he was very happy there for a long time. In fact, I think in later years, I think he wasn't so happy in Cambridge, largely because Elizabeth Anscombe arrived. And Bernard and she had the most appalling clash of temperaments and personalities. She was a rigorous Catholic. He was exactly the opposite. And she was, I think, outraged by Bernard's veneer of flippancy or humour. Which the rest of us loved, I think, but it wasn't to Elizabeth's taste. And so eventually he left Cambridge and went to the United States.
So when you were meeting Bernard in the late 60s, before you yourself went to Oxford, that was kind of the years when he, I think he wrote Morality, and he was writing books then against utilitarianism.
That's right.
But even in the book of Morality, you get the sense of a singular intelligence.
Yes.
And someone who's prepared, to say, I think he said something, says funny things, it's very dry, that moral philosophy found a new way of being useless, and that was by being, unstintingly boring.
Mm-hmm.
And so you saw a guy, a kind of in-house rebel,
Yes.
but yet knew the game better than anyone.
Mm.
And that's what intrigues me about Bernard Williams. He spent a
Mm.
lot of time, demolishing the citadel
Mm.
before he actually, quite late in his career, started building something anew.
Yes, I think that's right. It's only with things like philosophy as a humanistic discipline and so on that Bernard really found, I think, his métier almost as a sort of historical voice. I mean, he was a great friend of Isaiah Berlin's. And of course, Berlin, as you well know, was at least as much a historian of ideas as interested in the ideas themselves. He was interested in history for its own sake. And I think this must have been an influence on Bernard. But also, Oxford integrated philosophy and history much more than Cambridge had managed. Partly because the joint courses, PPE and grades, had components of history in them. Political philosophy was, bound to be largely concerned with, people like John Stuart Mill, the rise of liberalism, and so forth. And I think that was much more embedded in the Oxford culture than it was in Cambridge. In fact, when Bernard arrived in Cambridge, I know he set about introducing political philosophy as a part of the Cambridge course. I met quite a lot of resistance from the, as it were, logic-heavy culture of Cambridge. So, but he got his way eventually, quite rightly.
Yeah, very good. So if we just maybe reverse a little bit, because I do want to ask you about, you kind of gave us a good insight there about who your teachers were, and especially Casimir Louis and Braithwaite and Ian Hacking. But you were in Trinity College, which is one of the preeminent colleges in Cambridge.
Yes.
Who else were you meeting there amongst your peers that maybe have influenced you?
Well, I think probably the two most important, one was Edward Craig, who was and remains a great friend of mine. And another one was Crispin Wright, who Crispin was a year ahead of me, and Edward was 2 years ahead of me. But both of those became distinguished professional philosophers. Edward got the chair of philosophy in Cambridge eventually, and Crispin had a great career in St. Andrews and then in the United States as well. So those were two important voices. And I was very lucky because being a bit older than me, I fell into looking up to them, of course. And I think they were both very good role models. Especially, I think Edward, who was a very, very good philosopher, actually. Crispin was perhaps himself more flamboyant, rather along the Bernard Williams line, but he was very interested in logic, and in fact, his first big book was on Wittgenstein, and Wittgenstein's philosophy of mathematics, which is quite a niche subject. There was a group of friends called the Analysts. This was the Trinity College Philosophy Society. There were enough of us in Trinity to form a little society. There were probably about a dozen philosophers, something like 3 or 4 each year, 4 or 5 each year. So at any time, there'd be about a dozen people in the college. And we had endless discussions. We met formally in a rather sort of self-important undergraduate way once a week, and somebody would read a paper and we'd all tear it apart and so on. And that was really as much my education as anything that I learned from the Dons, from Casimir and Richard Braithwaite and Ian Hacking. I should also mention, actually, I should have mentioned when I was talking about influences from teachers, Jonathan Bennett, who was quite a powerful voice, and quarrelled with Casimir, both personally and professionally. They did not like each other, and but I liked them both, so we just got on well with them.
It's interesting you mentioned that, Simon, because the weekly chats you had with your peers who are slightly older than you, and that seems to be really important. For people who go into philosophy for their development, that their ability to, well, if you're in the analytic tradition, it's kind of almost gladiatorial, where people,
can be, yes.
And whether or not that's critical, it's almost kind of goes back to Socrates and the dialogue.
Yes.
Like the only way to learn philosophy is to do it dialectically.
Yes, I believe that's true. I think that as I said, I think I learned more from the analysts, this Trinity society, than I learned in any classroom. But of course, there was also the discipline of writing an essay once a week. That was the Cambridge style. You wrote a philosophy essay every week, and your supervisor, in this case Casimir, would go over it with you and ask why you said that. Why did you put it that way? Why, was this argument sound? Did you manage to uncover the really interesting points about this, or did you skate over the surface, and so on? So all that sort of kind of relentless criticism or self-criticism. But it's criticism with a point. It's not criticism for the sake of aggression or anything like that. None of us were aggressive with each other, but if you said something a bit silly, you could expect a certain amount of pushback from the others. And I think that was an education which I loved and thrived under. And throughout my teaching career, I've sort of tried to reduplicate it, to give my students the same kind of combination of encouragement and criticism. There's always a stick and a carrot, and if you overdo either, you go wrong. If you fail to point out the weaknesses in a student's essay, you're not doing them a favor. On the other hand, if you never give praise, you're not doing them a favor either, because they need encouragement. So that's a very important balance to find. And I think I found it in Cambridge.
Very good. I mean, something we might come back to later on, but the importance of writing and not just thinking in philosophy.
Yeah.
It's really important. I mean, I think a lot of analytic philosophy sells itself short by being appallingly badly written.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It does. No, there've been, you can name the really good writers in the last 70 years. You can probably count on the fingers of one hand. There've been very, very few. I don't think, Casimir wrote very little, and what he did write was in formal direction. So I think it's not fair to worry about his style particularly, but I mean, Jonathan Bennett was probably the best writer amongst the Cambridge people. And I think he took a lot of care over his style. He was let down, I think, a little bit, though, by being, in a sense, rather aggressive when it came to other people. He was anxious to show that he was ahead of the pack. And that sometimes meant pushing down on the pack a bit. I should have thought the best writer in that generation was probably Peter Strawson at Oxford. Certainly the most congenial to me, until Bernard came along, anyhow.
Yeah, well, Ayer, I thought, was quite a good writer as well. Whether
Yes,
you agreed with his ideas or not, he had a lovely, clear style, very
yes,
precise.
yes, he did. Yes, that's true. Ryle, I think, was. Um, I never knew Ryle. It's a pity because I think he was quite a remarkable figure in many ways.
Hmm.
Because
Okay.
he introduced PPE to Oxford back in the 1930s, and he actually wrote a review of Martin Heidegger's Being and Time, which is a very surprising thing for a very hard-nosed Oxford philosopher to have done.
Yes, and published it in mind. Well, he probably published it himself, but
Yes, that's right.
yes.
That's
Uh,
right.
but yeah, fair play to him. It opened the windows a bit, whether or not he agreed with them or not.
Yeah.
Um, well, we if we move maybe to Oxford now, because you finished your PhD in Cambridge and you spent a
Yes,
few years there, but then you kind of moved to Oxford in the early 70s.
that's right.
Um, can you explain why you went there?
Well, it was a job. The golden age for jobs was, in effect, coming to an end. There'd been quite a large university expansion in Britain in the 1960s. And indeed, if you got any sort of worthwhile degree at Oxford or Cambridge, you could probably expect to get into a university job somewhere. Cambridge had filled up. There weren't going to be any more permanent jobs in Cambridge for quite a while. Edward had got one. Another of my friends from Trinity, Jimmy Altham, had got one. So Cambridge was filling up with younger people. And I think had become clear there weren't going to be any permanent jobs on offer. And indeed, there weren't for quite a while. And I wanted to stay in academic life. I enjoyed it so much. So when a job in Oxford came up, I applied for it, and I was fortunate enough to get it. So I gritted my teeth and took the long journey to Oxford, which was very good for a long time. I was very happy there. And we had our children. I got married while I was still in Cambridge, just a couple of years before the move to Oxford, and we had our children in Oxford, and they grew up there. So I'm sort of bisexual. I've got a foot in both camps.
I mean, to an outsider, who knows nothing about Oxford or Cambridge, they probably think they're Tweedledum, Tweedledee. I mean, from a philosophical point of view, and from
No,
what were the differences? Were they bigger than the similarities?
No, I think the similarities are bigger than the differences, but there were certainly differences of style and differences of focus, I think. I mentioned the sort of logic-centered on logocentricity of Cambridge. I don't think that was there in Oxford. Oxford was certainly developing a philosophy of language in ways that Cambridge hadn't, but it was influential on Cambridge. The work of, for example, J.L. Austin, How to Do Things with Words, and Peter Strawson too. They travelled across to Cambridge pretty quickly and influentially. And of course, as we've already mentioned, Bernard Williams came from Oxford to Cambridge. He was not an Oxford figure. So there was a lot of interchange and a lot of similarities. The differences, I think, were ones of style. But there was a big difference in, as it were, the educational side, because Oxford has joint courses. Everybody who's reading philosophy as an undergraduate at Oxford is also reading something else. And the big course that I was involved with was PPE, philosophy, politics, and economics. And I think that had the potential to be a very good course. But in my day there, at any rate, I think the three subjects sort of bypassed each other. There was no serious philosophy of economics, which I think was a great mistake. Political philosophy tended to be divided between political theory and political philosophy. And later, when I was chairman of the PP examiners, this was in the mid 70s, no, a bit later than that, early 80s, I was very amused to find that there was a paper on political theory in the PP final examination. And the convention was that it was marked by somebody from the philosophy faculty and somebody from the politics faculty. And I was interested to notice that the divergence between those two marks was actually sort of worse than chance. It was almost predictable that if one side said this is a first-class paper, the other would say this is a third-class paper, and vice versa. So you can see there was sort of cultural differences and differences of style. And a result of that, I think, was there was very little interchange between the three subjects. There was very little cross-fertilization. And somebody like, say, Amartya Sen, who's an economist who knows a great deal of philosophy, or Partha Dasgupta now, those are people who were very Cambridge. In fact, both of them were at Trinity and were friends of mine. But there's nothing like that in Oxford that I ever found, anyhow. The economists did maths and made up economic models to try and predict, the effects of this and that. The political theorists looked at the history of ideas as much as anything, and very few people straddle the divide. Isaiah might have been one, but there weren't many, I think, who really brought the three parts of PPE together, and I think that was a pity. And it also meant that the undergraduates, I mentioned that in Cambridge you do an essay, philosophy essay every week, one essay a week. That was the norm. The undergraduates in Oxford were often doing two subjects, and they spend half the week on philosophy and half the week on one of the others. And I think that encouraged a certain kind of superficiality, that the skill of the journalist became more important than the skill of the academic philosopher, for example. I'm not saying that people didn't come through that education and become very good philosophers. It's certainly true they did. But I think it wasn't as intense as the Cambridge education.
That's interesting, because I mean, when you hear PPE, I would have thought there would have been a greater level of discipline integration as opposed to just three subjects, taught.
Yes, but I expected that, and then indeed, when I first went to Oxford, I was a bit nervous about my relative ignorance of certainly political theory, and even more so economics, which I still only have a very casual acquaintance with. But that didn't matter at all, because I was in my silo and they were in theirs, and there was very little. I don't ever remember going to a seminar in my Oxford years, a joint seminar with anybody in economics or politics, which is rather shocking, actually.
I think that's sometimes why chairs can be misleading. I mean, I think, people who held the Chitchell chair, like Charles Taylor or Isaiah Berlin,
yes,
were kind of people that were very cross-disciplinary.
Yes.
And yet below that chair, you probably found just, a swathe of what I call a bocage landscape, where everyone's just burrowing away in their own field.
Yes, that's right. That's right. it somehow wasn't encouraged. You're right to mention Charles Taylor and of course Isaiah and Bernard. Well, Bernard became very eclectic. Of course, Bernard started in classics, and he always had that as a main string to his bow. Um, uh, but even the classical philosophers, I think, the philosophers who taught classical philosophy, people like Michael Woods, tended to keep the classics and the philosophy pretty much apart, I think.
Um, when you were, so you're in the 1970s, you're getting used to this place. What were you working on yourself philosophically?
Right. I really rode two horses at the time. My PhD had been on the problem of induction. That is sometimes called Hume's problem, the problem of the uniformity of nature. Why do we expect the future to be like the past, to resemble the past in important ways, which science devotes itself to finding? And of course, Hume famously thought that rationality didn't get us to a uniformity of nature. Rationality simply confined itself to mathematics and logic, and neither mathematics nor logic was sufficient to give us any guarantee of the uniformity of nature. I became fascinated by that topic, by that problem, in my last undergraduate year in 1965. And I started reading avidly about about what was then called confirmation theory, the attempt to show that, say, a chunk of evidence could make a theory probable or rationally acceptable without entailing that it was true. It might still nevertheless be shown to be probable. So my PhD had devoted itself quite a lot to probability and to the problem of induction. And that's what got me eventually the doctorate and indeed a research fellowship. I haven't mentioned that in 1967, I got a research fellowship at Churchill College in Cambridge. So I left Trinity for Churchill. But I was only there for 18 months before getting the Oxford job. The other horse I was riding at the time, as well as this interest in general in the philosophy of science, was moral philosophy, curiously enough. I mean, I'm not a moralist by any standards, but I was very interested in in a way, it was sort of going right back to my exposure to G. Moore as a youth. I was interested in the problems of objectivity and subjectivity, not only as they arose in the philosophy of science in connection with, say, the degree of confidence you have in a scientific theory, but in moral philosophy as well. What had brought both those things together, I think, was reading Hume. David Hume famously had the problem of induction. He brought it into prominence, and he wrote extensively about causation, but he also wrote about moral philosophy. And those two sides of Hume appealed to me. Both of them appealed to me. And they are connected, and we could talk about that. But so I came away from my exposure to Hume, this was in the late 60s still, convinced that there were things to say which did connect both the ways people worried about moral philosophy and the ways they worried about things like causation and scientific confidence. So both those things would grab my imagination, and I was working mostly on those.
Okay, and I mean they actually in a way become your enduring interests. through your career. There's other things obviously as well. But if we look at like, well, on the first level, your idea of quasi-realism,
Mm.
and then on the other side, your interest, well, what a book you call Ruling Passions, which is basically a work in moral
Yes,
philosophy.
it is, yes.
But as you say, more interested in the status of moral claims as opposed to the substance of them.
Yes, that's very right. Exactly. When I say I'm not a moralist, that's what I mean. I'm not interested in telling people, how much of their income they should give to charity,
No.
or whether they're allowed to have an abortion or whatever it might be. But I am interested in the status of claims about those things.
Mm.
That's always been my focus.
And when I read, I read your early books, which were very, very formal philosophy.
Yeah.
But then I did notice a break when you wrote your essays on quasi-realism, which had a more there was more air in them.
Yes, I think that's very right. Yes, there is something a little bit suffocating about Cambridge. Again, I think the figure of More has something to answer for. I mean, I mentioned More's writing is painfully slow and painfully there's an enormous parade of exactness. Doesn't mean that he actually said things which were exactly right all the time, but there was this sort of suffocating sort of sense of agonizing over things. And this was very Cambridge, you were supposed to put your head in your hands and worry and worry and worry. And I think my early writings were very constipated. I don't like looking back at them. I mean, instead of just coming out and saying something, you'd say it is not impossible to think that there might be some truth in etc.
Yes.
An awful lot of that kind of circumlocution, and thank God I grew out of that, I think.
Well, it's just difficult on the reader, and we don't have the oracular look of the philosopher while he's writing this, which makes it even more impenetrable. Yeah. But maybe if we look at the if we start maybe, because I think they are the two key areas really of your focus. Maybe if you talk first about your idea about quasi-realism, and maybe if you can give a sense of what that is meant to be, what problem that is meant to be providing a solution to.
Okay. Well, again, the problem goes back to More's Principia Ethica. In that book, More argued very persuasively, I think, against the identification of moral properties, goodness. Let's take goodness as an example. But it's going to go for right and duty and cognate terms. But he argued very powerfully that you couldn't reduce natural properties. I'll talk about that in a second, what reduction is supposed to be, to natural properties. Natural properties, I think, are best described as ones that fall under your observation, or at any rate are the topic of the scientific discovery. So it might be causally quite complicated properties, but they're the ones which are amenable to scientific inquiry, which includes observation and correct ways of theorizing. More argued that moral properties escape that; they're somehow different. Had a variety of arguments. The most famous is called the open question argument, and what he meant by that was, even if you took great care to specify what you think is the summum bonum, the thing we should all aim for, the good in life. So you, for example, you write a little essay about human happiness, let's say. You say, that's the good, that's what we should be thinking about all the time. It may be right. You may be a very good moralist, and you may have got hold of the thing we should think about that gives value to other things. But the claim that it's the thing that gives value to things in general is itself an open question. It's always subject to challenge, and you can't prove it by going to a dictionary. it's not given just with your understanding of the language that it's human happiness that is the good. You're open to challenge. Somebody might come along and say, what about octopuses? What about animals? Doesn't their happiness count? Or somebody might come along and say, well, I'm not sure humanity is all that important. What about trees and nature? And so on. So you're always open to challenge. You may think the challenge is to be shown off. You can answer it, but it's there. It's an open question. And Moore deduced from this that moral properties were very special. There was sui generis. You knew about them by some faculty called intuition. So his view is often called intuitionism. And yet they're very important and they direct our lives. Pretty quickly in the 20th century, people got dissatisfied with that. And a number of writers, probably again starting in Cambridge, started to say, no. Ethics is more about sentiment than about cognition or intuition. It's a matter of how you feel about things. And so the position called emotivism became quite dominant. Freddie Eyre, you mentioned, I think, was an emotivist. The great Frank Ramsey, who was a young genius of Cambridge philosophy in the 1920s and 30s, 1920s, he was an emotivist. Ogden and Richards, two sort of literary theorists, come philosophers, were emotivists. And C.L. Stevenson, Charles Stevenson, had written the most important book on emotivism. So the idea, you could see the landscape as two different ideologies opposing each other. On the one hand, there were the emotivists, and on the other hand, there were people who insisted on the cognitive status of moral judgments. They're things you can be right and wrong about. They're not mere expressions of feeling. And these two camps, as it were, had separated. And there were arguments, a lot of arguments took the form of saying that the emotivists can't do justice to some aspect of our moral thought. So although emotivism might seem superficially attractive, it's got to get rid of some of the ways we think. We think that there's a right or wrong about ethical issues, that you can bring reason to bear on them, that we can even know some ethical things to be true. Whereas if all we're doing is sounding off or expressing attitudes or emotions, none of that vocabulary would be in place. You wouldn't be able to talk about moral truths, moral facts, moral arguments as solid or not solid. And so the cognitive appearance, if you like, of ethics it was argued that appearance had to be junked by emotivists. And some emotivists had more or less accepted that. Eyre did. So Eyre's chapter on ethics in Language, Truth and Logic, his great positivist tract, is pretty dismissive. It's as if, the chapter is about theology and ethics. And Eyre was an atheist, and he thought theology was a pretty junk subject, and he thought the same about ethics. Other people had tried to be much more conciliatory. C.L. Stevenson was an emotivist, but one who seemed to think, that moral thought was important, and you needed to try and think about it the right way. Anyhow, this had grumbled on, and I became convinced that the arguments that were in play weren't very good. Arguments taking the form, emotivists can only say this, or if you say this other thing, then you've got to be a cognitivist, you've got to be an anti-emotivist or an intuitionist. It came to a head, I think, in 1977, although I've been thinking about it earlier than that. But in that year, John Mackey published a very influential book called Ethics, Inventing Right and Wrong. And in effect, Mackey argued that emotivists were right about the nature of morality, but they were wrong about the form it could take. And many of the things that we say about the good or the right or the duties and obligations have to be given up if emotivism turns out to be the right theory. And I wasn't having that. I thought, no, I want emotivism to be the right theory. It's good and, as it were, scientific. It doesn't postulate mysterious, non-natural properties, which we know about by some mysterious faculty of intuition. It doesn't have any truck with that. It just sticks with human beings and how they feel about things. But I don't see that it's a mistake to talk about moral truth or moral facts. And so I set about showing that the debates had been misconstrued, that people were making mistakes in the philosophy of language. And that was what eventually became a criticism quasi-realism. I don't think that's a wonderful title for it anymore, but at any rate, I got stuck with that as the name of it. It's grumbled on ever since. I didn't succeed in shutting down the debate, which I'd hoped to do. But I did put a marker on the debate, which now quite a lot of dispute about the nature of ethics swirls around some of the things that I'd sort of introduced or claimed. Some writers, perhaps most recently, the most influential has been Derek Parfit, loathed anything to do with emotivism, thought the tinge of irrationalism and subjectivity wouldn't go away, and he made it his life's work to defend a version of intuitionism, the very theory that Moore had. That is, there were moral properties, we know about them. We know about them by intuition and reason, especially reason. And they're not objects of perception in the way that books and chairs and tables are. We don't know about them by means of the senses or by receiving information from them. They're not causally active. But we do know about them rather along the lines of the way we know about mathematics. And he had a whole plethora of arguments against emotivism. Emotivism was really the 20th century successor to David Hume and Adam Smith, the Scottish sentimentalists, and for that matter, George Berkeley, the Irishman, in the 18th century. Now, the 18th century battle was then joined by Kant, who wanted something more, as it were, truth-orientated in ethics, and got it via reason. He got it via reason. Parfit is closer to Kant than to Hume or Adam Smith. Now, I don't think Kant himself took any time to argue against Hume on ethics. He just laid down his own different system. But Parfit spent a lot of time arguing against people like myself. And so that debate grumbled on because until he died in 1917. He was a very influential figure. And there were others too, Thomas Nagel in America. And probably in America, emotivism is less popular than in Britain. But that's because Americans like to feel they've got right on their side. British don't care about it so much.
Yes, and I mean that is. I know you mentioned that kind of almost jokingly, but I think there is something maybe deeper to that. There is a kind of a temperamental thing going on here.
Yes.
And I think philosophers are kind of slow to admit the incursions that temperament can make into our philosophical convictions.
Oh, I think that's a very good remark, Johnny. I think that's absolutely right. It's, I think I've been convinced of the essential correctness of emotivism ever since reading Hume. And I don't really care how the detailed arguments fall out. If somebody came up with a phenomenon in our moral thought, which emotivism really couldn't put up with, I might be prepared to go some way with the error theorists, with John Mackey, and say, well, we've got to give that up because emotivism is so clearly right. But other people say, take the other tack. And I think it has to do with, well, Parfit made it into a matter of authority. People want their own opinions to have a foundation or an authority or a backing that means it's not just us. It's Nagel's phrase. And the emotivists are quite happy with saying, no, it's just us. It is just us, eventually. It's we who make moral judgments. It's we who cajole and persuade and order people to do things. And it's we who have to argue about it if we get disputes about what to do and what's permissible and what's obligatory and so on. So it is just us. When we're standing on our own feet, there's nowhere else to stand.
I think that's frightening to people. I mean, I think,
yeah.
In fact, I think it came out very well in the late Ronald Dworkin's. But he wrote a great paper called "Truth, You Better Believe It."
Yes.
And then he developed that in, Justice for Hedgehogs.
Hedgehogs, that's right.
And I think he does give this nightmare scenario for himself. He says, I have these dreams. I have this terrible nightmare where I imagine that, there is just my view of,
yes,
and there's nothing more.
Yes.
And that's where the temperament comes in. It's this, it's just my view. I can't live with that. And then you get other people, maybe like yourself or Mackey or Eyre, who are okay with that because they say, well, that's the reality, so I'm going to face it.
Yes, exactly. That's right. And it's obviously a deep discomfort. It's allied, of course, to, Richard Rorty was somebody who noticed this and stressed it. It's allied to the worry some people have about us being alone in the universe. And they turn to a theological reality to try and argue that there's more to the world than the things that natural science shows us. There's got to be a source of authority somehow lying over and above the mere human jumble and human cacophony of different voices. And I think, I respect the religious temperament up to a point. I certainly think that the worry about the size of space and time and the insignificance of human life is a genuine worry for people. But I won't let my views about the truth, persuade me that that's more than wishful thinking. I think it is something people wish for, but I don't think it's going to be given them, either in this life or the next.
Yes, I mean, one of the areas where I do think emotivism is challenged is when you consider moral conflict.
Yeah.
And I think that's where, and I think that maybe it's changing our notions of what moral objectivity is, but that's where I do find someone like Berlin or Nagel in a way, and actually in a different way, David Wiggins, with this idea of cognitive underdetermination,
Yeah.
where the idea that our experience of moral conflict suggests that there is something to moral objectivity, or we're not just talking about I like vanilla ice cream, you like chocolate ice cream.
No.
Because that way we can part our ways. If I firmly believe that it's wrong to kill blue-eyed babies at birth and you don't, one of us wants to leave that thinking you're right and I'm wrong, or the other way around.
That's right. That's right. I think that's right. I mean, our morality takes the form of assertions, and where we've got assertions, we apply truth and falsity indiscriminately. You're going to say that's true, you're wrong. And I think it's very difficult for people to reconcile that with the sentimentalist tradition or the emotivist tradition. I think one of the things I've tried to chip away at in trying to stop people worrying about that so much is I think this notion of subjectivity is very dangerous. I think it's a bad term, actually. I think it probably came into prominence with the Romantic movement. I don't think I'm sure the term isn't there in any of Hume's writings. And I don't think it's there in Adam Smith either. It became a worry, I think, in the 19th century, possibly with the death of God. That is when people started losing faith in Christianity and its doctrines. Then they worried about the void that seemed to open up in front of them. And you've got people like Dostoevsky saying, if God is dead, everything is permitted. Well, that's just not true. I'm not permitted to go out of this house at more than 30 miles an hour. It wasn't God that laid that down. It's the government that lays it down. And we're good at laying down the law for ourselves and others. It's something that we can do, and some people find it very attractive to do it, become trolls on Twitter and things. But doing it with thought and care, you've got to think very deeply about human life and get involved with everything the tradition of moral philosophy will throw at you. And it's as Socrates said, this is no trivial matter. It's how you live your life we're talking about. And so, of course, people get hot under the collar and get steamed up and they argue about it and throw around words like fact and rationality and reason and knowledge and so on. I want to say that's all right. That's just the surface form these things take. That the underlying reality is as the emotivists said it was.
And that's kind of, in a way, this conversation is helping us see why you are more interested in the status of moral assertions rather than the substance of them, because you ultimately have to go back here, because people argue, and then you say, well, what are we arguing about? And both sides are convinced they're correct, and then a philosopher comes in and tries to make sense of this, and a philosopher's way of making sense that might upset certain people, and it might also upset philosophers, who have different views.
Oh, it does. I mean, there's no doubt that people like Parfit and Nagel did have this, as you say, temperamental or emotional attachment to the cognitive side of things. They weren't happy with the godless universe, or the universe which offers no instructions on how to live. I want to say, no, the universe doesn't offer these instructions how to live. We can offer them to each other, and we have to be careful how we do it. So I'm not advocating a sort of casual "I like ice cream, I don't" kind of attitude to these disputes. A dispute, a term that my colleague Alan Gibbard uses here, is plans. He talks about plans. And the disagreement in plans particularly in plans of how to live, is a very, it's a very definite disagreement with a definite topic, which is what we're going to do.
Mm.
A disagreement in, say, about the morality of abortion or something like that is a very definite disagreement. And you're going to have to try to advance considerations which persuade the other side, if you can. And that's what we try to do all the time.
Well, it's if we maybe just change focus a little bit and actually make it a bit broader, because you mentioned Rorty there.
Yeah.
You know, again, a kind of one of these quite polarizing figures.
Very.
You know, some people find him like, you know, he's the moral, you know, he's the philosophical version of the Antichrist.
Yes.
And other people see him as the great liberator. But
yeah.
For me, it kind of comes down to how you interpret the meaning of our inescapable contingency, which he believes goes all the way down.
Yes, yes.
So, and I think this might be a nice segue into your latter preoccupation with the importance of truth.
Yeah.
So could you maybe start from maybe Rorty and maybe work your way into why you think truth is salvageable in a Rortyan world?
Yes, good. Well, you've put it very well, Johnny. I mean, I think Rorty saw Western philosophy, if you like, as polarized, and rather like the way that I've been talking about intuitionists or cognitivists versus emotivists. And he thought that it goes deeper. It's not just moral philosophy which gets in a tangle over this, it's all philosophy. So he divided the tradition, if you like, into two sort of camps. There were people he thought of as basically rationalists. That's Descartes, Leibniz, Kant, Spinoza. Philosophers who, starting with Plato, I think, philosophers who thought that there is a rational structure to the universe and we can get hold of it. So here, this could embrace moral philosophy, but it goes wider than that. As soon as you think that, for example, science is the activity of reason in a way that, say, I like ice cream, I don't, isn't, then you're on the side of the rationalists. On the other side, Rorty positions himself alongside people often called pragmatists, starting with the American trio of William James, John Dewey, and Charles Sanders Peirce. But he sees people like Foucault, Derrida, a lot of postmodernists, thinkers in a more continental tradition than the analytical philosophers. He welcomes them. He thinks they've got an important insight, which, as you nicely put it, is the insight that our contingency, our humanity, goes all the way down. We can't escape the way things, as it were, appear to us. We shouldn't worry about whether the way they appear to us is the way they are, because it's always appearance. And even if you try and, like Descartes, to achieve a kind of God's eye point of view, or a point of view from which you can reassure yourself that the way things appear to us is indeed the way they are, you'll always fail. There's no escaping appearance. I think Rorty, is perfectly entitled to draw up the teams like that, draw up the battleground like that. It requires smoothing over quite a lot of wrinkles in the history of philosophy. It's not as monolithic as that makes it sound, but it was a good template to get people interested, as it were. When it came to truth, well, obviously, if you're interested in some notion of truth, which, let's say, capital T truth, which is supposed to stand outside the way things appear, supposed potentially inaccessible to the way things appear, then Rorty's obviously against that. Where I think Rorty's writings get a lot of their excitement, and perhaps too much excitement, is that he doesn't always take care to say that it's a notion of truth with a capital T that he's against. He's against, it's not only that he's a champion of appearance as opposed to reality, capital A appearance as opposed to capital R reality, capital T truth. It's that he's also suspicious about the credentials of, as it were, ways of systematizing appearance so that the way the world appears to us is useful to us. Now, that's what pragmatists should be bothered about. But Rorty was very keen on, for example, the virtues of disciplines in the humane studies, like literary criticism. And he wanted to take science and mathematics and things like that down a peg or two. So there wasn't going to be a divide between, say, the authority of science and the authority of a good literary critic. They both are deeply contingent. They're both dependent on us and appearance. And at that point, quite a lot of people, including myself, start to worry about the bus, getting off the bus, because I do think that there are better and worse ways of coping with appearances, coping with experience, just as there are better and worse ways of planning for the future. And I think that science gives us a very, very good set of handles to hold on to as we approach any future. I don't think the authority of science is something we should mock or try to dilute, or try to just put alongside the authority of a particular reading of a play or a particular way of interpreting the character of Hamlet or something. Those are nearer to being matters of taste than, for example, the question of whether a vaccine protects you against COVID. That's not at all near being a question of taste to me. There's a right or wrong about it. It may be a right or wrong about appearances, but it's a right or wrong about the way we systematize appearances and meet the future. And there are better and worse ways of meeting the future. Some ways are very, very foolish. And so I think Rorty was, in a sense, betrayed the better elements of pragmatism. I think pragmatism in the English tradition of philosophy was best represented by somebody I've already just mentioned, and that was Frank Ramsey, Cambridge figure. I think the one unquestionable genius that philosophy's seen in this last century, the 20th century. If anybody looks at his career and his legacy, it's absolutely astounding. He died when he was 26 years old. And he left, in mathematics, there's Ramsey numbers. In economics, there's Ramsey saving theory. There's Ramsey taxation theory. In philosophy, there are Ramsey sentences and logic. And he's right up there at the forefront of, the mathematical revolution that was eventually introduced by Gödel and Tarski in the 1930s, by which time he was dead. So it's a terrible tragedy. He was a great, great genius. And Ramsey said, he wasn't interested in epistemology as such. He certainly wasn't interested in Descartes' sort of skepticism or worries about whether our appearances correspond to reality or not. But he was deeply interested in there being better or worse ways of anticipating the future. And he wrote about probability and decision theory extensively from a subjectivist point of view, but a subjectivism tempered by knowledge of the frequencies with which events do fall out and can be expected to fall out.
Mm.
So I think, like Hume, he was, as it were, a naturalist philosopher, but he, as it were, didn't fling skepticism at us in the way that, say, Rorty does. And I think that's a more sane attitude, if you like.
Yes, I mean, your position seems to lead more to pluralism rather than,
I think in the terms you use in your Isaiah Berlin book, I think that's exactly right. I mean, there's a fact of plurality about human beings, namely that we have pluralities of opinion, people whose opinions differ, whether it's about morality or about COVID vaccines, but people whose opinions differ. And the question is how we evaluate and come to a sensible preference for some ways of forming opinion as opposed to others. Mm. Now, I've no objection to making that the central problem of epistemology, as opposed to Cartesian skepticism. And to that extent, I agree with Rorty. He called himself a pragmatist. But pragmatism goes along with a pretty central thought, which is that there are better and worse ways. There are ways that lead to success in action and ways which lead to failure. And I think believing that there's no such disease as COVID, or that I think that's a way of forming opinion which is deeply unsuccessful and eventually be eradicated by Darwinian processes, but it may take a long time.
Yes, I mean, we seem to be living at a time where even the most basic distinctions seem to be getting conflated.
Yes.
Distinctions we thought were safe and secure are now, and that's where I think Rorty is to blame. I don't think he meant it. I think, he was a very fine thinker. But even just making a very basic, there's a very big difference between an X-ray of me.
Yes.
And that tells me if I've got cancer or not, and someone that does a painting of me.
Yes.
They're both of me, but they're incomparable in their purposes and in their what they're telling the world.
Yes.
And yet we, if you go down maybe a crude version of Rortyism, to be fair to him, it's well, they're both the same. They're different, but they don't. One is not epistemologically better than the other.
Right.
That seems to be crazy.
That does seem crazy. Yes. I mean, Rorty didn't tip into pragmatism so much as into skepticism. Yeah. And yet pragmatism in the hands of Peirce, especially Peirce, who associated pragmatism with a kind of Platonic ontology. But Peirce or James, I mean, it's an old battle. In a way, it was joined, I think, by Russell and Moore in the 1900s, when they were very worried about William James and James's sort of slightly Rortian side. Although I think James was far more sober theorist than Rorty. But they saw skepticism as sort of lurking around everywhere. And of course, there became the central problem of Russell and Moore's epistemology. Well, I don't think we have to think that there's start again. I don't think epistemology depends on, some enterprise of trying to upset Cartesian skepticism, this kind of skepticism which says we can't know what the real world is like because we're condemned to a world of appearance. I think we can put that aside. You've still got to argue about the rights and wrongs of ways of dealing with the world of appearance, if you insist on calling it that. And one way, I think, is signaled by Rorty. Well, let's get over the appearance-reality dichotomy. Let's console ourselves with the thought that it's contingency all the way down and appearance is all we've got. So we're dealing with one world. But of course, with the disappearance of the real world, it disappears the appearance as well. I mean, the two live off each other. And then you're just left with the world, and we've got to cope with it. One of the things we have to cope with is things like COVID and so on. And we better find the right ways of doing that. Because there are ways which will lead to success and ways which won't.
And I mean, that I think brings us actually back to something we talked about really at the beginning in relation to Bernard Williams and the importance of history and how we see philosophy as a discipline. You know, a lot of what we've talked about here is actually, I think actually it's less Rorty. I think it's, in a way, it's fundamentally a Kantian problem we're dealing with.
Yes.
And that, you know, we can't access the noumena.
Yes.
And, you know, these realists are kind of, these moral properties are in the noumena. It's kind of, things get very, very complicated and seemingly inescapably so.
Yes.
But then when you switch gear a bit and you start, well, let's look at philosophy as a historical discipline. What are the sort of things that have endured?
Right.
And what are the sort of things we can retain confidence in? That word is critical to someone like Bernard Williams.
Yes.
What's your view on that and the importance that history now is asserting itself more in the analytic tradition?
If we go back to thinking about Rorty, which we talked about a few minutes ago, I've always thought that Nietzsche is absolutely wonderful on perspective, you know, the different perspectives you can bring to things. And of course, he's also, no doubt, greatly influential on Rorty in the idea of abolishing the real world and the apparent world, abolishing that dichotomy. And, you know, I think it's the pandemonium of all free spirits in the introduction to the fourth part of Twilight of the Idols, which always affected me very greatly. There's a sort of this marvelous thumbnail of Western history. Starts with Plato, goes through Christianity, comes to the Enlightenment, and then finally, you know, Nietzsche is the person to overcome, to aufgehoben, the dichotomies that have plagued the tradition. But I think Roger's treatment of this in his books on things like music and so on is I think very sensitive and very good. You know, he's not you know, he's not in cloud cuckoo land, but he is in a world where we filter things through our own sentiments, our own ways of feeling about things. And, you know, when he talked about art and imagination, one of his earliest books, he, which is still a very interesting introduction to aesthetics, you know, he makes quite an 18th century distinction between what's just there anyway, you know, the geometry of the building or the materials or whatever it might be, versus what you make of it and what you can make of it and what it encourages you to make of it. And I think that's fundamentally important to appreciating the arts. And he describes it as well as anyone, I think. No, I think it's very good. I mean, I'm a bit prejudiced because I knew him quite well. I mean, we were direct contemporaries at Cambridge. And although I was somewhat suspicious of him in the Thatcher years when he started to develop very right-wing politics, in later years I saw quite a lot of him at the British Academy, and we discovered considerable affinities.
It's interesting that, because one of the things I liked about that book, that he's some, he talks about I think the phenomenological turn in European thought is also quite
Yeah,
important.
that's right. Yes.
And he does refer to Dilthey and what Dilthey called the historical social reality.
Yeah.
And phenomenologists don't, they talk, the Slabensfeld idea, which doesn't bring up
Yeah.
the dichotomies that,
No,
Descartes gave us.
no. It's a while since I read Roger's works of this kind. But of course, the idea of the Lebenswelt is, I think, a very useful idea. The idea of the, it's you can see it as a kind of successor of the 18th century distinction between primary and secondary qualities. There's what's just there anyway. You can't get round it. You can't get past it. The rock in the path. That's it. And then there's the cultural, historical, interpretive capacities and resources that you will bring to it because you're a creature in history with a civilization or a way of looking at things behind you. And these, of course, may be very variable. But doing justice to what is in front of you is set you as a task, I think. It's not that there's such a thing as the true way of looking, but there are stupid ways of looking, and there are better ways of looking, and there are better ways of listening. I mean, if I listen to, for example, quite a lot of jazz music, I'm stupid. I don't know what's going on, and I've got no right to talk about it. If I listen to classical music, I've got a slightly better grasp of what's going on, and I feel I could talk about it. I'd be shy talking about it because I'm not a musician. But the point is to recognize when you're able to talk about something, you've got a certain fair wind behind you. You've got a fair wind of tradition and of work and of people's appreciation. And I think that's very important to literary criticism, to artistic criticism, to any appreciation of the arts. And I think Roger was profoundly sensitive to that. And he taught a whole, I think, generation of people to be careful about it. It's in a way Roger had a very Edmund Burke kind of mind. That is, he valued enormously things like the tradition of the common law, for example. Thought that embedded centuries of wisdom, which you overturn by inventing legal codes, rather like Napoleon did, at your peril, because you will probably do worse. It's an evolutionary kind of idea. There's been generations of trial and error, finding what works, or finding what doesn't work, finding what seems to deliver something which seems more just at the time. And you tread on that tradition at your peril. You learn from it if you possibly can. And I think that was Roger's conservatism. It was a very Edmund Burke kind of conservatism, which I share. I mean, I think he's right.
Yes, I mean, just going back then.
I would never. Sorry, just to preempt Twitter trolls and people. It doesn't mean I vote Conservative. I wouldn't dream of voting for the present Conservative government, but it does mean that I like conserving traditions and being careful about how you depart from them.
Yes, conservative with a small c.
Exactly.
I mean, it's interesting. I mean, this is, I think, a real enduring conflict in the philosophical tradition, going back to Plato.
Yes.
Where we seem to have this inability, well, especially philosophers do, to live with the secondary, well, let's say we call Lebenswelt, or you might call them secondary properties.
Yes.
As, the lived world. And just let's be happy with that. Let's make sense of that.
Yes.
Without drawing distinctions between that looking unfavorable with the noumena
yeah.
or the Platonic forms,
Or just the scientific world,
or the
which
scientific world,
is,
exactly. Because then we start devaluing
mm,
the Lebenswelt or secondary qualities.
yeah, very
Um, and
dangerous.
it kind of goes almost back to Plato's cave. We all want to get out and see what the sun looks like, because this cave, we
Yeah,
can't believe that the cave is all there is to it.
right.
What do you make of that conflict? And do you think it's something we can get over, or do you just think it's inescapable?
Well, I think there is an inescapable element to that conflict. Not that we have to side with Plato or side with Locke against Berkeley, for example. And Locke believed in the primary secondary distinction, Berkeley didn't. Um, I think it's rather that we have to recognize that science itself is going to deal with certain kinds of qualities and properties of things. Science is only going to deal with properties which are causally tractable. It's good at finding the functional relationship between things like forces and mass, distance, acceleration, and so on. The human mind, our minds, are adapted to a different set of properties: color, sound, um, touch, shape, size, shapes and size, in a different way. And I think it's very dangerous to suppose that all truth is scientific truth. I don't think that's true. I think there are truths which are to be achieved by human understanding, by acquaintance with traditions, by understanding the history of works. Historical truth isn't scientific truth. Scientists, it's a very important philosophical question whether science deals with time at all. But certainly we do. We live in time and we have to cope with time. And we have to cope with the fact that some things are sediments of time. And if we don't do that, we lose our humanity.
And I think that's really why it becomes more interesting, the more historically
Mm.
conscious, self-conscious philosophy, because now you're getting more into tangible stuff, you know?
Yes, yes, you can get hold of it. Yeah,
Yeah, you
yeah,
can get a hold of them, and you can actually then, a whole new debates open up. For example, did we make the right turn?
yes,
At Kant.
yes,
Did we make the right turn, in whenever it was, when we made rights everything
yes,
and duties less important? Well, maybe, so you stop being smug about the present, and you
yes.
start being more curious about the past.
I think that's absolutely right. I think I think as an educator, I've always thought one of the great virtues of philosophy is that it defeats or tries to defeat smugness. Um, you've got to learn that your first thoughts about things aren't always your best, and they're always capable of improvement. You can never say you've got to the final word, the last word on anything. And you might want to say that this is as far as we've got so far. But that in itself is a kind of confidence. I think that you mentioned Charles Taylor a while back. Now, Taylor's an interesting case, I think, along with perhaps Alistair MacIntyre, as being very unusual in thinking that the Enlightenment represented a wrong turn. There's a sort of hankering there after an idealized version of the Middle Ages, when God was in his heaven, all was right with the world. And I think I'm deeply opposed to that. I don't think that the Middle Ages had a way of coping with the world which was not subject to improvement. And I do think the Enlightenment brought an improvement in our way of coping with the world, both in politics and ethics and in science. And I think that you know, it always amazes me to think of Charles Taylor or Alistair McIntyre going to the dentist. Um, we looked in a museum at what dental equipment looked like in the Middle Ages.
Yes, we're actually going to take this filling out, Mr. Taylor, now without a nice injection.
Yes.
So how you feel about that? Although to be fair to Taylor, I think McIntyre is more guilty of thinking that some sort of reassertion of Thomism would work, whereas I think Taylor is more nuanced in his prescriptions. And
That may well be true.
yes.
I haven't recently read very much Taylor. I haven't actually recently read. Well, let's see. Last book of Alistair McIntyre I read was what's it called? Dependent Natural Animals or something like
Rational Animals. Yeah.
Yes, Dependent Rational Animals, which I thought was rather good actually. But it's a plea for understanding that we're dependent. And I think one of the things we are dependent on is not just each other, but we're dependent upon huge swathes of tradition and improvement, gradual journey to where we are now. Maybe a journey downwards in some respects, but it's certainly been a journey upwards in others. At least I find it very difficult to countenance anybody who thought otherwise.
Yes, I mean, and I mean, when we go back to looking at your work, Simon, it is interesting that some of the books you've written. I mean, you've written some amazing books. I mean, you have this knack to make quite a difficult subject accessible.
Well,
to, especially I thought your book Think and Being Good were particularly successful in that regard. They kind of reminded me a bit of Bertrand Russell's The Problems of Philosophy, or and going back to something we kind of did mention earlier, about the importance of good writing, clear writing.
Yes.
Also engaging writing. I mean, it's not that analytic philosophy is unclear; it's just so unengaging, and as a complete. Whereas, Russell and the really great philosophers, they said, "Well, I have to entertain this reader as well as guide him."
Yes, I know, and I don't like to boast at all, and I'm very conscious that there's better writing than mine in the tradition. But I do think I put myself in the position of the reader quite well. I'm very conscious of what it's like. I try to be very conscious, perhaps, of what it's like to come to this rather strange inquiry, not knowing what to expect. And I think that's perhaps a rarer gift or a rarer perspective on things than one would like to think. I mean, it's not just sort of management speak and things, but you do get the most extraordinary writing, not just in philosophy. The first ever computer I got was somewhere back in the early 80s, I think. And it came with the programming language BASIC already installed. And I was quite keen to learn how to program in BASIC. I thought I could manage this. And the first sentence of the manual, the very first sentence was, BASIC 86 is a fully implemented version of BASIC 86. Sorry, say that again. BASIC 86 is a fully implemented version of BASIC 86. I thought, what kind of person writes that? I mean, he or she must have absolutely no conception of who it is they're writing for. And that was, about the end of my programming career. Well, it wasn't quite, but I mean, it took some getting over. And I think that a lot of writing is solipsistic. People don't, conceive of the problem from the learner's point of view. One of the good things about the Oxbridge career is, at least unless you're confined to one of the research colleges like All Souls, is that because you're seeing one-on-one streams of students day in, day out, you've got to improve your communication skills. You know that every year they're going to come along with the same kind of problems, same kind of difficulties. You've got to find a way of educating them, and that means finding a way of listening to them and talking to them. And unless you can see it from their point of view, you're not going to be very good at that. And I think it's a very important part of pedagogy in general.
And tell me, like that is interesting. That teaching can be very helpful to become a better writer, or at least the need to become a better writer.
Yeah.
Another thing that strikes me about the tutorials, because I did a few of them in my previous life. I used to teach, but now I'm in management speak, as you mentioned. But is that sometimes a student could ask a question that could really floor me.
Oh, yeah.
And I'd say, when I'd start thinking about the question, I mean, sometimes I probably look like I was floored there and then, but then usually after, I'd be thinking to myself, well, what am I doing here? It was that fundamental. I just felt I was wasting my time, either because I couldn't answer that question, therefore, and if I can't answer that question that's come up so basically, then I'm wasting my time here. Or the nightmare scenario, the philosophy doesn't have an answer to that question. Therefore, what are we doing here?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think there are quite a lot of questions that philosophy doesn't have an answer to. But that's for me not a matter of despair. I mean, obviously it means that as a writer, if I'm trying to write, for my peers, for other philosophers, I've got to find questions which I do think has an answer, or at least on which progress can be made. And I hope I've always tried to do that. But you're absolutely right that at a very fundamental level, there'll be questions which you might find it almost impossible to answer, and certainly impossible to answer within the confines of a teaching episode. I mean, one was, is it always a mistake to think in terms of an opposition between appearance and reality? That's a very good question. It doesn't take very long to frame, but it will take a hell of a long time to answer.
Yes. Yes, you're not going to conclude the episode by answering that one.
No, exactly. I mean, you just have to deflect it and say, well, let's think about aspects of this. What kind of opposition, so on. So there's always ways to keep it going.
Yeah, actually, and that brings you to a question I did want to ask. And like when you look back on your career, because you would have done a lot of teaching, especially in Oxford, and then you moved to America.
Yeah.
Who, if you would like to mention, who were your greatest students, or if you don't want to go there, what made a great philosophy student for you? What were their qualities?
Good. I don't really want to. A lot of my students are in the trade, in the profession. I don't want to hear their names dragged through the mud or put on a pedestal. But I've had a lot of very, very good students. I think the first thing, of course, is they've got to be interested. It's absolutely pointless doing philosophy unless you're grabbed by it. You've got to be interested. After that, there are kinds of diligence, which obviously you admire, and they get tested for in examinations. People who've read the stuff. There are, I think, I don't think I've never met anyone who sort of completely knocked me out as a student. I mean, Russell, for example, was knocked out by Wittgenstein. Wittgenstein impressed everybody, obviously, had a fantastic personality. I'm not saying a fantastically nice personality, but a fantastic amount of personality. And I think he literally knocked Russell out in the sense that Wittgenstein's criticisms basically turned Russell, by Russell's own account, they turned him away from the sort of deep foundational questions in the philosophy of mathematics that he'd hitherto been obsessed by and contributed hugely to, of course. Now, whether Russell should have been knocked off his perch by Wittgenstein, that's a good question. Or whether it was simply something, sort of some force in Wittgenstein's personality which did this. I think I can't think of an experience like that. The one genius that I've come across genius communicators. Sol Kripke was one. Casimir Louis was one, as I've mentioned. At least he was to me as a young man. I think the one philosopher whose genius has impressed me is David Lewis, who had an extraordinary capacity for argument and for logic, as it were. He saw his way through problems or around problems in very strange and unusual ways. I think he deserves the title genius. I mean, when I taught for a semester at Princeton, there was endless stories about Lewis. Lewis was still there, along the lines that somebody would come along to give a philosophy talk, and Lewis would sit there stroking his beard, and he'd open the question session by saying, I've got 13 objections, 8 you can answer, but 5 I don't think you will. And he'd have them in his mind, I mean, absolutely titanic mind. I've never come across a student with that kind of just grasp and range, which made me think, he should be in the teaching chair and I should be at his feet. But perhaps that's a bit of conceit of my own part. Perhaps I'm just blind to some of the genius that's sat at my feet and I haven't let it flood over me as I should have.
I think it is quite rare, I imagine. I mean, I think Hart felt that about Dworkin. He did feel, I think, when he was teaching Dworkin that, geez, this guy is just so brilliant that I do feel when I'm correcting his papers, he should be correcting his own papers. He should be correcting his own homework, because he just seems to be. And Hart was no slouch, as we all know. But
no, he wasn't. Did Hart actually said that about Dworkin? Did he?
Yes.
That's interesting.
Yes.
Yeah. Is that in Nicky Lacey's book, or?
It is. Sorry. It's in Nicky. A.D. Lacey. Yeah, that book. And but he also wrote it, I think, in a letter. There was something in a letter that he referred to it as well.
That's interesting, because I sat in an Oxford group which included Dworkin for the last 3 or 4 years before I went to America, and I always thought Dworkin argued more like a lawyer than like a philosopher. He was always, as it were, presenting a case, which he'd do very well, but not always. I felt he didn't always show that he cared about the truth, as opposed to caring about victory. And that used to get under my skin. And I'd have thought Herbert Hart would have noticed that, because he was a very courteous man himself, and a very objective, and I found him a very attractive man, Herbert.
Yes, I agree. And I think it might say more about Herbert Hart than maybe Dworkin, because
I think it might, yes.
I remember, Isaiah Berlin was instrumental in getting Herbert a fellowship at the New College in philosophy back in the. And I think Herbert was always apparently suffered a lot of lack of self-confidence in his philosophical abilities.
I think that's right. Yes. Yeah, he
So
was very
maybe that's what
modest.
it was about, you know. I mean, without.
Yeah, that may be. Perhaps his modesty went so far as, uh, in a sense, overlooking what I thought was just slightly, um, not false, but something that rang not well, something that didn't quite ring true in the way that Dworkin argued. I think Dworkin, what was it Boswell said about Johnson? There's no arguing with Johnson. If his pistol misses fire, he'll turn it round and knock you down with its butt. And I think there's an element of that about Dworkin. Always irritated me.
The thinker that we haven't talked about, but you've written about, and I think he's quite interesting because you've talked about Bernard Williams, and this is Hilary Putnam.
Ah, yes.
And you've written about him, and I think that is a very interesting debate where he disagrees with Williams.
So do I, yes.
It goes back to Kant. Is there anything you'd like to say about that? Because I think it is a fascinating debate.
Well, I think it's an aspect of what we've talked about already, the appearance-reality distinction. I mean, I was more on Bernard's side there than Putnam's, partly for the same reason why I'm more on Ramsay or James's side as opposed to Rorty. I mean, at that time, I'm not sure this stayed with Putnam till the end of his life, but at the time of that debate, Putnam was, of course, against the absolute conception as he saw it, and Williams was defending at least a version of it. And Williams had confidence that our empirical methods, and especially our science, brought us closer to the absolute conception of how things are. It was things like painting and literature and so on wouldn't do that. They'd might improve the appearances of things, but they wouldn't do as science does. So that was the thing that Putnam took exception to. Although Putnam, of course, had a much greater training in science than Bernard. Putnam started in mathematics and physics. He was trained by Reichenbach and Hempel, I think, and Williams was a classicist. Still, they took those sides in that debate, and I think really it's. Well, it gets confusing because Williams, of course, Williams's contrast was with the world of secondary qualities, which are things like colours and smells and noises and so on. And there's no doubt that the way we see colours, hear noises, smell smells, is very obviously contingent and could be different, could have been different, perhaps is different in some societies for all we know. But like Locke, but not like Berkeley, Williams thought there was a fundamental division between those and the properties which are amenable to quantification and to scientific investigation and measurement and so on.
The primary properties.
Primary properties. And Putnam was, as it were, taking Berkeley's side against Locke. So it is part of the appearance reality problem. And I think if you can achieve a sort of monism where you get over that dichotomy, you'd begin to find clear water between Williams and Putnam. But it's not easy to do.
No. And that was what I suppose it was my way of asking me, where do you think are the interesting avenues of inquiry now in philosophy today? Where do you think is the interesting work?
I think there's got to be I know the area where I think there's got to be progress, and I'm very pessimistic about what's happened to it, is the philosophy of mind. I think that people worried about consciousness in a way, they've gone back to a pre-Wittgenstein, pre-Austin, pre-Wilfrid Sellars world, in which dualism was, as it were, lurking. What's been christened the new problem of consciousness, or the hard problem of consciousness, is it's basically the Cartesian problem again. It's a Cartesian problem about mind and body. And, you know, we thought that with Ryle, I should have mentioned Ryle, Wittgenstein, Austin, some combination of those thinkers at the middle of the 20th century, they thought of themselves as transcending that problem, getting rid of it. And then it came roaring back. And writers such as Nagel and not Chappell, what's his name? The Australian.
Chalmers,
David Chalmers, exactly. They sort of reinvented the old Cartesian problem, and it's as if Ryle and Austin and Wittgenstein had never worked, never lived, and I think that's a pity. But quite how we, as it were, disengage ourselves from that problem, that's not easy. I think there's been an enormous misunderstanding of what neurology is going to do for us. That is, people think that you can get into the brain like you get into a motor car and find out exactly how it works. And I don't think you're going to do that. You're just going to find an awful lot of complexity. But the complexity isn't going to make it easier to understand how it is that we see things in the way we do, how it is that we hear things in the way we do. And I don't think anybody's got hold of a route which is obviously going to lead to those advances. And I think it's needed. So if I had my time again, or if I'm still spared to have some intellectual energy in the future, I think that's what I'd really like to contribute to. But I don't know how.
Do you think then, therefore, that philosophy took a wrong turn when it gave up the linguistic turn?
Yes, I do. I think it's. I think the reinvention of metaphysics that came with, to some extent, Kripke and Putnam, and then writers like Chalmers, Nagel. I think that was, in effect, a return to the past, and I regretted it. I mean, I remember feeling very optimistic about philosophy when this was one of the things that drew me to it, I think. In the 1960s, we really felt, things were moving. I know that one of the main topics of conversation in my Trinity days, in my undergraduate days, was the private language argument of Wittgenstein's. It was thought by some to have, finally put the kibosh on any reinvention of the problem of consciousness. And alas, it didn't. The ghost rose again.
It's interesting, isn't it? That, I mean, I think when you look back, because I've actually been immersing myself in Austin the last number of years.
Oh, yes.
And reading, for me, the Austin of his collected essays for me is more interesting than the Austin of How to Do Things with Words.
Yes, me too.
Particularly like things like A Plea for Excuses, or there's just so rich.
Yes. Yes.
And
Sense and Sensibility is great too.
Oh, that's great! Yeah, brilliant book. And they're actually another tragedy, a bit like you were talking there about Ramsay. I mean, that Austin died so young as well.
Yes, he did. Yes, he was quite young.
And I think the missed opportunity for me was that I think Strawson, something much better could have come out of Strawson and Austin. Strawson seemed to be looking at the conceptual analysis, whereas Austin was looking more at linguistic analysis. But they're almost caricatures of what they're much more. They transcended those sort of rubrics. And
Yes, I think they did. I had a lot of respect for Peter Strawson. I got to know him quite well. Well, not terribly well. I mean, it was a big age gap, but you know, I always enjoyed his company. He had a very good mind and a sort of old-fashioned courtesy, which was, I thought, very attractive. Um, I mean, he could be absolutely needle sharp and actually quite difficult. There was a famous occasion in the graduate seminar in Oxford when he gave some very elaborate and very carefully sort of worked account of Kant's transcendental deduction or something like that. And a very voluble continental gentleman in the audience, a graduate student, launched into saying all kinds of paraphrase and you know, is this what you're saying, Professor Strawson? Is this what you're saying? And Peter sort of calmly lit his cigarette and listened to this, and at the end, if what you say is what I say, yes. Otherwise, no.
Yes, brilliant. Cut right through it. The last question, probably, Simon, and then I'll free you up.
Yes.
Is maybe just on your editorial of Mind, because in the 80s you did become editor of what kind of the premier British philosophical journal, Mind. How did you enjoy that being editor of that
I
journal?
enjoyed it enormously. Yes. I felt really. I mean, in those days, I had endless energy. At least looking back, I seem to have. And we had a young family. My wife was in full-time editorial work with Oxford University Press. We were busy to bits. I also had a large undergraduate teaching load, large train of graduate students, and somehow mine just sat on top of it all. It was fine. So for 6 years or so, I really enjoyed it. Eventually, I think the workload ground me down and was part of the reason why I became receptive to offers from the USA. And eventually went to the USA, of course. But no, I wouldn't blame Mind for that. Mind was just perhaps one of the last straws that broke the camel's back. But Oxford breaks a lot of camels' backs without Mind. But no, I enjoyed it very much. It kept me in touch with an awful lot of what was going on, and enabled me to exert sort of, mild patronage, directing philosophy in the ways that I hoped by selecting the works I admired. And a friend of mine, a very good philosopher called John Kenyon, also in Oxford at that time, and I would exercise a sort of tyranny. We decided what went into the journal. We very seldom employed referees because, well, as I once put it, if you get a referee's report on a paper, you've got two things you have to decide about. You've got the paper and the referee's report. There's no guarantee the second is better than the first. And so you're doubling your workload. And it's better, I think, to do it yourself. Nowadays, of course, you have to have 6 referees and, a human resources program behind you to make sure you're not biased. I didn't care about bias, as long as I was biased in what I regard as the right direction.
Yes.
And that was it.
And what were the highlights? Do you remember papers during your period?
Yes, I do. I remember some. I commissioned a series called State of the Art, and I wanted the best people in the world, or the best people I could cajole into writing such things, to talk about where we were in the philosophy of mind, the philosophy of knowledge, and so on. And we had some very, very good, Jerry Fodor, Sidney Shoemaker, all kinds of absolutely top-ranking philosophers. contribute to that. And I think it acted as a signal that the journal was back in town. It was anxious to be at the forefront of good philosophy, which was my ambition when I took it on.
So, Simon, just to kind of end the interview with a few more personal questions, how have you found retirement?
Beautiful, lovely, easy. I have a reasonable circle of friends. I enjoy the open air, I enjoy walking, I enjoy leisure. I spend far too much time doing things like crosswords. And I find the lack of pressure very refreshing. I wake up every morning thinking, what shall I do? Instead of thinking, what do I have to do? And that's pure pleasure to me.
Right, sounds like you've it's the perfect arrangement.
It is, yes.
So you mentioned there you do crosswords, but apart from philosophy and apart from crosswords, what have been your other intellectual interests?
Oh gosh, I'm a bit of a magpie. I pick up almost anything. I have always been reasonably keen on reading. I mean, and I read. Again a magpie. I read anything. I love. Well, let's see, at the sort of easy end of things, I'm perfectly happy to curl up with a P.G. Wodehouse. At the harder end of things, I very much enjoy most English literature that I know of, and things like Proust, which I admire enormously, and the Irish writers. I mean, I think reading Ulysses some 20 or 30 years ago was a real eye-opener for me. I enjoyed that book enormously. And so on. I'll pick up anything practically. There's a wonderful woman called Anne Fadiman who used to be an editor at the New Yorker. And she was also an outdoors person. She was holed up in some winter hut or something, and the only thing she had to read was the something like the 1917 manual of the Toyota gearbox. And she said that reading that was like reading Dante's description of the eternal rose, because if there's nothing else to read, that's what you read.
Yes, you make do. Well, that was a terrible thing to have to make do with, though.
Right.
But and my final question, Simon, would be: if you were stranded on a desert island and you could only choose a book, a piece of music, and a luxury, what would you take?
The book, well, it depends a little bit how expansive the idea of a book is. I mean, a book of Shakespeare's plays would go a long way. A favorite book, I think I'd love to revisit Proust in French, because I started this in French, but I decided it was going to take a lifetime. So I think on a desert island, I might have the leisure to go into it in French. I need a dictionary, I'm afraid, so that's 2 books, but I'm allowed that. As for music, again, I'm a little apt to cheat. I'd love something like the Beethoven late quartets, or some of the Schubert song cycles, Winterreise, Schöne Müllerin, and but then of course there are other composers as well. Could I ever live without some Haydn, some Mozart, some Beethoven? Now, I think the late quartets would be the one thing I'd really love. I think the Heilige Dankgesang from Opus 132, the A minor string quartet, is just inexhaustible piece of music. I think I could die happily listening to that. But then there's things like the Schubert Arpeggione Sonata. Oh, too much.
And do you have a particular favorite version of that Beethoven?
I've got the Guarnari quartets playing it, and I think that's about as good as I know that it gets, but there may be others. Schubert, the Arpeggione, I've got Yo-Yo Ma and Emmanuel Axe, and that's a wonderful recording. Yeah.
Very good. And your luxury?
My family.
Oh, okay. Well, that's a slight cheat, but anyway, I'll give it to you. Given that we've only given you three choices, you
I should have said wife and family, of course, but
yes,
that's included. Yeah. Yes. I don't go in for luxuries very much. I'd like a decent stove to cook with, and I assume this desert island has a decent source of fruit and vegetables, and so on. Then I'd be quite happy.
Very good. Well, thank you very much, Simon. It's been a real pleasure talking to you, and I wish you all the best.
And to you, Johnny. Very great pleasure.